The mansion door slammed shut with a bang that echoed through the frozen night. Elena Torres was left outside, barefoot in the snow, without a coat, without a purse, without a single belonging other than the maid's uniform she was wearing. Her hands trembled, not only from the biting cold, but from the humiliation that still burned in her chest like a living ember. 15 minutes earlier, she had been cleaning Victor Ashford's office when she found documents she should not have seen. Contracts. Bank transfers. Numbers that made no sense for a simple domestic worker. Before she could process what she was seeing, the door burst open violently. Victor entered like a hurricane, his icy blue eyes fixed on the papers in her hands. At his side, his mother, Beatrice Ashford, watched with a cruel smile on her thin lips. Elena dropped the documents immediately, her heart racing, but it was already too late. Nosy, Victor spat the word like poison. I thought you knew what your place was here. Elena tried to explain that she was just cleaning, that the papers had fallen from the desk, but Beatrice interrupted her with a dry, cutting laugh. Your place has always been beneath us, dear. And you forgot that. The older woman stepped closer, her heels clicking against the marble with surgical precision. 7 years working here, and you really thought you were part of this family? That we were your friends. The words pierced Elena like sharp blades. For 7 years, she had cooked, cleaned, and cared for that house as if it were her own. She had comforted Victor when his father died, organized Beatrice's social events, worked holidays while her own family celebrated without her. All of it for minimum wage and crumbs of respect. You're just a maid, Victor continued, ripping the apron from her hands. And maids who don't know their place don't even deserve the clothes they wear. That was when everything collapsed. Beatrice ordered the security guards to search her, looking for stolen items. They emptied her pockets, her backpack, even took the coat she had bought with her own money. They demanded she hand over her phone, claiming it was property of the house. They confiscated her personal documents from the maid's room, saying they needed to verify if they were authentic. Elena begged. She explained that she needed her papers, her phone to call someone, her coat because it was snowing outside. But Victor only smiled, a smile that never reached his empty eyes. You should have thought of that before snooping around things that don't concern you, he said, motioning for the guards to drag her outside. Beatrice approached one last time, her expensive perfume filling the air between them. People like you are born to serve people like us. Never forget that. Now, standing in the snow that burned her bare feet, Elena watched the warm lights of the mansion through the windows. She could see the silhouettes of Victor and Beatrice toasting in the main hall, celebrating something. Perhaps her expulsion itself was reason enough to celebrate. She began to walk, each step agony on the ice. She didn't know where to go. She had no money, no phone, no documents. She was completely alone in a city where the only people she knew belonged to that cursed mansion. The cold seeped into her bones, her vision beginning to blur. That was when a black limousine stopped beside her. The window rolled down, revealing a gray-haired man in an impeccable suit. His eyes showed immediate recognition. Miss Torres, he said with a reverence that completely contrasted with the treatment she had just received. I am Thomas Reed, your personal attorney. I have been looking for you for years. Elena stared at him in confusion, shaking violently. Personal attorney? She was a barefoot maid in the snow. None of this made any sense. There's been a mistake, she managed to say through chattering teeth. I don't have a lawyer. I have nothing. Thomas quickly stepped out of the car, placing his coat over her shoulders. The fabric was warm, soft, expensive. He helped her into the heated vehicle before continuing. You have far more than you imagine, he said, handing her a leather folder. Your father, before he passed away, left very specific instructions. He knew that one day you would need this. Elena opened the folder with trembling hands. Inside were documents, photos, records she had never seen before. Her father appeared in images alongside important men, signing papers in luxurious offices. There were certificates, property contracts, company shares. And at the center of it all, a name she recognized immediately, Titan Industries. Victor Ashford's company. Your father was Alberto Torres, Thomas continued, watching understanding slowly dawn on her face. He was the original investor in Titan Industries. Without his capital, Victor Ashford would have nothing. Absolutely nothing. Elena felt the world spin. Her father had always been a reserved man when it came to his business. He died when she was only 17, and her mother never spoke much about his past. She grew up believing they were ordinary people, honest workers. "Why am I working as a maid in the house of someone who owes everything to my father?" she asked, her voice breaking. Thomas sighed, a look of sadness crossing his face. "Because Victor and Beatrice Ashford hid this from you. When your father died, they manipulated the documents, created shell companies, made it look like the investment came from another source. They knew you were underage, that your mother didn't understand business. They took advantage of that." Anger began to replace the cold in Elena's bones. 7 years. 7 years cleaning, cooking, being humiliated. And all that time, that family had been living off her father's money. Off money that should have been hers. If you're enjoying this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video. Leave a comment telling us what you think and which city or country you're watching from. "What do I do now?" Elena asked, her voice steadier than she expected. Thomas smiled, a smile that promised justice. "Now, Miss Torres, we make them pay for every single day they treated you as invisible." During the following weeks, Elena uncovered a truth that transformed her pain into determination. Her father was not just an investor. Alberto Torres had been Victor's mentor, the man who believed in him when no one else did. He had lent not only money, but knowledge, connections, even the technology that became the heart of Titan Industries. Thomas showed her old emails, recordings of meetings, signed documents. In all of them, Victor treated Alberto like a hero, promising he would never forget his debt of gratitude. Promising that he would take care of his family if anything happened. Promises that turned to dust the moment Alberto died. "They made your mother sign papers," Thomas explained one rainy afternoon in his office. "They said they were funeral documents, insurance forms. In reality, they were waivers of rights. Your mother didn't read legal language well. She trusted them." Elena felt tears burn her eyes. Her mother had died 3 years earlier, carrying with her the guilt of not having been able to give her daughter a better life. If only she had known the truth. If only she had understood what she signed. "That's why I looked for a job at the mansion," Elena murmured, the pieces finally fitting together. "My mother always said the Ashfords were good people, that we should be grateful to them. I wanted to meet them, to understand why she spoke that way." Thomas shook his head sadly. "They manipulated your mother so completely that she died believing she owed them favors. When in fact, they owed everything to your family." Meanwhile, Victor and Beatrice continued their lives as if nothing had happened. Elena discovered, through investigations Thomas hired, that she was not the first employee discarded that way. There were others. Women who worked for years in the mansion only to be thrown out without references, without proper pay, without dignity. One of them was Carla, who worked 16 years cooking for the family. She was fired when her arthritis made it difficult to peel potatoes at the speed Beatrice demanded. They threw her out like trash, without even paying her labor rights. Another was James, a driver for 12 years. He made the mistake of witnessing Victor driving drunk after a party. He was gone the next day, threatened with a lawsuit if he told anyone anything. The list went on. Gardeners, nannies, security guards. All treated like disposable objects when they no longer served the Ashfords' purposes. All silenced by fear, necessity, or abusive contracts they barely understood when they signed them. "They think they're untouchable," Thomas said, organizing more documents on the table. Victor inherited his grandfather's arrogance, who built his fortune exploiting immigrants. Beatrice comes from a family that has always bought its way out of trouble. Together, they're a toxic combination. Elena studied every document, every piece of evidence, every detail of the Ashfords' lives. She discovered that Victor was expanding Titan Industries using questionable practices. Bribes to secure government contracts. Theft of intellectual property from smaller companies. Tax evasion through accounts in tax havens. Beatrice, in turn, ran a fake charity network. She raised millions in the name of sick children, but only a fraction reached hospitals. The rest financed her extravagant lifestyle, her international trips, her outrageously expensive jewelry. "They built an empire of lies," Elena said, feeling nauseous as she realized she had cleaned the offices where these schemes were planned. "And I was there, invisible, listening to phone calls, seeing documents. I could have noticed." Thomas placed his hand over hers in a paternal gesture. You were young, you needed the job, you were taught to trust them. This is not your fault. It never was. It's theirs. Elena took a deep breath, feeling something harden inside her chest. She was no longer the frightened girl freezing in the snow. She was no longer the invisible maid who kept her head down. She was the daughter of Alberto Torres, and she had a legacy to honor. How long do we need to build the case? She asked. Thomas smiled. It's already built. I've been working on it secretly since your father died. I was just waiting for you to turn 25 so you could legally take control of everything. And you turned 25 last week. Elena looked out the office window. Outside, the city stretched in every direction. Somewhere in that vastness stood the Ashford mansion, where Victor was probably drinking expensive wine and Beatrice was planning her next social event. Where they continued living off the blood and sweat of people they considered inferior. They will pay, she said, her voice calm but filled with determination. Not for revenge. But because it's right. Because other people need to know who they really are. Thomas opened one last folder. Inside were a court summons, lawsuit documents, meticulously organized evidence. The court date is set for next week. Victor and Beatrice think they're going to answer for abusive labor practices. They have no idea what's really waiting for them. Elena held the papers, feeling their weight in her hands. The weight of justice, of truth, of years of silence finally finding a voice. Her father had built something real with honest work. Victor had destroyed that legacy with greed and cruelty. But now, Alberto Torres's daughter was about to rebuild everything. And this time, the Ashfords would learn that not all power comes from birth. Sometimes, it comes from those who had to fight for every crumb of dignity. They called me nosy, Elena said, a cold smile touching her lips. They're about to find out I was much more than that. I was the owner of everything they have. Elena spent the following days doing something Victor and Beatrice had never imagined possible. She studied. Not only the legal documents, but every detail of Titan Industries' operation. Thomas brought in technology specialists, forensic accountants, and lawyers specialized in corporate fraud. All of them were impressed by how quickly she absorbed information. Your father had the same talent, Thomas remarked as she identified inconsistencies in the company's financial reports. He could see patterns where others saw only numbers. Elena discovered something even Thomas didn't know. During her 7 years in the mansion, she hadn't just cleaned offices. She had observed, memorized, mentally taken notes. She knew the schedules of important meetings, the names of business partners, even the digital lock codes Victor thought no one else knew. When you're invisible, people talk in front of you as if you don't exist, she explained to Thomas. I heard phone conversations about fraudulent contracts. I saw Victor receive envelopes of money from politicians. I witnessed Beatrice forging receipts for the fake charity. Thomas realized he had more than a client. He had a perfect witness, someone who had been inside the criminal operation for years without the criminals ever realizing it. Elena was the secret weapon they never saw coming. Together, they put together a surgical strategy. They wouldn't just go to court to complain about labor practices. They would completely dismantle the Ashford empire, brick by brick, lie by lie. Elena contacted every former employee Thomas had found. Carla, the cook with arthritis. James, the silenced driver. 15 others who had been discarded over the years. At first, they were all afraid. The Ashfords were powerful, vindictive, dangerous. I was afraid too, Elena told each of them. They threw me into the snow without shoes, without documents, without anything. But I discovered something important. They only have power because we allow it. Because we stay silent. Because we believe we're too small to fight. One by one, the former employees agreed to testify. Carla brought records of unpaid wages. James had audio recordings of Victor making threats. Others had emails, messages, concrete proof of years of systematic abuse. Meanwhile, Elena did something that surprised even Thomas. She asked to visit Titan Industries' main factory, posing as an operational efficiency consultant. Victor would never see her in person, so the risk of being recognized was minimal. She cut her hair, wore glasses, dressed in formal clothes. Inside the factory, Elena spoke with ordinary workers. She discovered unsafe working conditions, delayed salaries, promised benefits that were never paid. She discreetly photographed everything. Recorded testimonies. Collected evidence no lawyer would ever find because no one would think to look for it. "You're taking a big risk," Thomas warned when she returned with flash drives full of information. "If they find out who you are before the trial." "They won't find out," Elena replied with a confidence she didn't even know she possessed. "Because they still see me as the frightened maid. They can't imagine I'd be capable of this." The truth was that Elena was changing. Every day away from that mansion, every hour studying the Ashfords' crimes, every conversation with the other victims strengthened something inside her. The girl who cleaned floors was becoming the woman who would clean the moral filth of an entire family. Thomas arranged meetings with trusted investigative journalists. Without revealing details, he planted seeds of curiosity about Titan Industries. When the lawsuit exploded publicly, the press would already be ready to cover every angle of the story. Elena also did something personal. She visited her parents' grave for the first time in years. She knelt on the damp grass and told them everything she was doing. "Dad, I didn't know who you really were. Mom, I didn't know what they did to you. But now I know. And I'm going to fix this. I'm going to make them pay not just for what they did to me, but for what they did to you. To all of us." The wind blew softly through the cemetery trees, and Elena felt something like peace. It wasn't about hate. It never was. It was about justice, about truth, about making sure no one else would ever be thrown away like trash by that family. On the night before the trial, Thomas and Elena reviewed everything one last time. Stacks of documents, recorded testimonies, photographic evidence, forensic financial records. It was a mountain of evidence that made denying the truth impossible. "They'll try to intimidate you in court," Thomas warned. "They'll try to make it look like you're a resentful maid making up stories. Victor has expensive lawyers. Beatrice knows how to manipulate public opinion." Elena looked at her reflection in the office window. She was no longer the frightened girl in the snow. She was no longer the invisible maid. She was Elena Torres, daughter of Alberto Torres, and she was about to reclaim everything that was rightfully hers. "Let them try," she said calmly. "Because when I walk into that courtroom and say my full name, when I show who I really am and what they really did, there won't be any expensive lawyer or manipulation that can save them." Thomas smiled, proud. "Your father would be very proud of the woman you've become." Elena took a deep breath, feeling the weight of tomorrow on her shoulders. But it wasn't a crushing weight. It was the weight of responsibility, of justice, of purpose. And she was ready to carry it. "Tomorrow," she said, "the Ashfords will learn a lesson they should have learned a long time ago. People are not disposable. And truths don't stay buried forever." The courtroom was packed. Journalists filled the front rows, cameras ready to capture every moment. Victor Ashford entered with the confidence of someone who had never lost a battle, his Italian suit impeccable, an arrogant smile on his lips. Beatrice walked beside him, expensive jewels gleaming under the lights, her chin raised in barely concealed disdain. They had come prepared for a simple labor lawsuit. A dissatisfied former employee complaining of unfair dismissal. Their lawyers brought signed contracts, allegations of theft, technical justifications. It was just another Tuesday for them, another small person trying to extract money from those who had succeeded. Victor scanned the room, looking for the plaintiff. His eyes passed right over Elena, who was seated beside Thomas at the prosecution table. She wore an elegant suit, her hair professionally styled, makeup discreet. She looked nothing like the maid in uniform he had thrown into the snow. The judge entered, and everyone stood. When they sat again, Victor's lawyer was the first to speak, confident and rehearsed. "Your Honor, this is a simple case of an employee who violated her position of trust by rifling through private documents. The dismissal was justified and lawful. We are here only because the plaintiff seeks undeserved financial compensation." That was when Thomas stood, and something in the courtroom shifted. He didn't look like a lawyer defending a labor case. He looked like a prosecutor ready to dismantle an empire. "Your Honor, this is not a case of unfair dismissal. This is a case of systematic fraud, theft of intellectual property, embezzlement of inheritance, and the building of a fortune on lies and crimes spanning decades." Victor frowned, confused. Beatrice leaned in to whisper something to their lawyer, but Thomas continued before they could react. "I would like to call the plaintiff to testify." Miss Elena Isabel Torres. Elena stood, and for the first time, Victor truly looked at her. His eyes widened in shock as he recognized her. The maid. The girl he had thrown into the snow. But now she was different, transformed, radiating an authority that made him instinctively recoil. "State your full name for the record," the judge requested. Elena took a deep breath. This was the moment. "My name is Elena Isabel Torres, only daughter of Alberto Enrique Torres, founder and original majority investor of the company now known as Titan Industries." The silence that followed was absolute. Victor turned pale. Beatrice dropped her purse. Even the journalists paused mid-note, processing what they had just heard. "Impossible," Victor murmured, but his voice betrayed his growing fear. Thomas began presenting evidence. Original documents proving that Alberto Torres invested 80% of the company's initial capital. Signed contracts where Victor promised equal profit participation. Emails exchanged between Victor and his lawyer immediately after Alberto's death, planning how to hide the truth from the widow and minor daughter. "They made my mother, who barely spoke the language, sign documents saying they were funeral forms," Elena testified, her voice steady. "They were waivers of rights. Documents that transferred legal ownership of my father's shares to shell companies controlled by the Ashfords." More evidence was presented. Bank records showing suspicious transfers. Testimonies from accountants instructed to falsify reports. The patented technology that made Titan Industries valuable had been developed by Alberto, not Victor. "My father trusted Victor Ashford," Elena said, tears controlled but shining in her eyes. "He treated him like a son. And when he died, that trust was used to steal my future, his honor, and reduce my family to nothing." Beatrice tried to defend herself. "She's just a resentful maid making up stories." Thomas smiled coldly. "A maid you hired without knowing who she really was. A maid who spent 7 years inside your house, listening to conversations, seeing documents, witnessing crimes." The next hour was devastating for the Ashfords. Former employees testified about abuses. Factory workers described dangerous conditions. Forensic experts detailed fraud in Beatrice's charity organization. Audio recordings played Victor making threats and offering bribes. Each piece of evidence was a brick removed from the fortress they had built with lies. Elena watched Victor crumble, his face moving from arrogance to shock, then terror. Beatrice wept silently, her mask of superiority finally cracked. "Your Honor," Thomas concluded, "Titan Industries was built with the money, knowledge, and technology of Alberto Torres. By law, 80% of the company belongs to his sole heir, Elena Torres. The defendants not only stole this inheritance, but committed tax fraud, money laundering, and created a pattern of abuse that destroyed dozens of lives." The judge reviewed the evidence for several minutes. When he finally spoke, his voice was grave and definitive. "Considering the evidence presented, I order the immediate freezing of all assets of Titan Industries and the personal accounts of the defendants, Victor and Beatrice Ashford. I order a full forensic audit. Criminal proceedings will be opened to investigate allegations of fraud, embezzlement, and organized crime." Victor tried to stand and protest, but his lawyer held him. It was too late. Everything was collapsing. Elena looked directly at Victor for the first time since entering the courtroom. There was no hatred in her eyes. Only justice. "You called me nosy for looking at documents," she said calmly. "But those documents were always mine. This company was always mine. And now finally, the truth is where it should have always been, exposed to the light." Handcuffs were placed on Victor and Beatrice. As they were led out, the reality of their actions finally hit them. The empire they had built on lies was crumbling, and the maid they had discarded in the snow was now the owner of everything. 3 years had passed since that day in court. Titan Industries, now renamed Torres Technologies, had been completely transformed. Elena had not only taken control but rebuilt the company from the ground up, keeping only honest employees and implementing practices her father would have approved of. Factory workers now received fair wages, real benefits, and safe working conditions. Carla was hired as a human resources consultant, using her experience to ensure no employee was ever treated as disposable. James managed the transportation department, implementing strict safety policies. Every person who had been abused by the Ashfords received full financial compensation and formal apologies. Elena created a fund to help former employees who needed medical or psychological support after years of degrading treatment. Under her leadership, the company's value tripled, not through fraud or shortcuts, but through genuine innovation, ethical partnerships, and investment in people's well-being. Elena proved that success and humanity were not opposing concepts. The money stolen from Beatrice's fake charity organization was recovered and donated to real children's hospitals. Elena established a foundation in her parents' name, focused on education for youth in underprivileged communities. Hundreds of students now had scholarships, opportunities her parents never had. Victor and Beatrice were sentenced to 10 years in prison each. Their luxury assets were auctioned to pay compensation. The mansion where Elena had worked was transformed into a support center for domestic workers, offering free legal assistance and guidance on labor rights. It was on an autumn afternoon that Elena returned to that place for the first time since her expulsion. The walls now bore bright, welcoming colors. The office where Victor had humiliated her was a meeting room where employees learned about their rights. The maid's room where she had slept for 7 years was now a counseling office staffed by volunteer psychologists. Elena walked through the corridors, touching the walls, remembering. There was no longer anger. Only a deep quiet, the peace that comes from knowing justice was served and something positive was born from the pain. Thomas found her in the garden, where she was observing the rose bushes she had once tended. "How does it feel to be here?" he asked. Elena smiled softly. "Different. This place no longer has power over me. It was a prison, now it's a sanctuary. The Ashfords turned this space into something ugly, and we turned it into something beautiful." That night, Elena had dinner with the leadership team of Torres Technologies. These were people she had chosen not for their name or connections, but for their character and competence. They laughed together, shared ideas, treated one another with genuine respect. "Your father would be proud," Thomas said during the toast. "Not just for the company, but for the person you've become. You could have used all this power just for revenge. Instead, you used it to build something better." Elena thought of Beatrice's words that terrible night, "People like you are born to serve people like us." What a cruel lie. The truth was that no one was born to serve or be served. People were born with potential, dignity, and self-worth. What set them apart was the choice to use their power to uplift or destroy. Months later, Elena received a letter. It was from Victor, written from prison. He asked for forgiveness, said he had reflected on his mistakes, that he finally understood the gravity of what he had done. The letter ended with a request for her to visit him. Elena held the paper for a long time, feeling the weight of those words. Part of her wanted to ignore it, to let Victor face his consequences alone. But another part, the part her father would have approved of, knew what to do. She went to the prison on a cold morning. Victor looked aged smaller, all layers of arrogance peeled away by reality. When he saw her, his eyes filled with tears. "Elena, She raised her hand, silencing him gently. "I didn't come here to hear apologies, Victor. I came because you need to understand something important. What you did to me, to my family, to dozens of others, had consequences. But those consequences didn't define me. They only revealed who I always was." Victor lowered his head, ashamed. "You saw me as invisible," Elena continued, her voice calm but firm. "And maybe, at that moment, I was invisible to you. But invisibility is not weakness. Sometimes, it's the greatest strength. Because while you weren't seeing me, I was observing, learning, growing. And when the time came, I was ready." She stood to leave, but paused at the door. "I hope you use these years to truly reflect. Not on what you lost, but on who you hurt. And when you get out, I hope you're a better person than when you went in." Elena left the prison feeling lighter. The cycle was complete. There were no more chains binding her to the past, no hatred poisoning her future. That night, she visited the cemetery once more. She knelt between her parents' graves, the gentle wind moving her hair. "We did it," she whispered. "Not only did we reclaim what was ours, but we created something better. Something that makes a difference in people's lives. Father, your company lives on, but now it has a soul. Mother, no one will be deceived like you were. And I am no longer that frightened girl in the snow. I am strong. I am just. I am free." The lesson Elena learned was not about revenge or power. It was about resilience, dignity, and the quiet strength of those the world underestimates. It was about transforming pain into purpose, humiliation into humanity. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video. Leave a comment telling us what you thought and which city or country you're watching from. Stories like Elena's remind us that our value never depends on the recognition of others, but on the truth